There are very few things in this world that money cannot buy. For example, if you're convicted of a crime in California, you can actually pay a fee for a nicer jail cell that's away from the other prisoners. How much do you think this upgrade would cost you? It's $82 a night. Yes, to a degree we all understand that the money market controls nearly every aspect of society. My presentation today is focused on this issue. What is the role of wealth in the justice system? And what should it be? And most importantly, how does this tie back to our conception of justice? What I have found is that the greatest barrier to access to justice is wealth. Let's hear from the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. She said, "The most advanced justice system in the world is a failure if it does not provide justice to the people it is meant to serve. Access to justice is therefore critical." Unfortunately, many Canadian men and women find themselves unable, mainly for financial reasons, to access the Canadian justice system. I want us to first look at how wealth is distributed in Canada. In 2012, Statistics Canada did a survey of financial security and asked Canadians what the country's wealth distribution should ideally be and what they think it actually is. The survey was then compared to the reality of wealth distribution. Now let's take a look at the results. Here we see a chart of what Canadians think the ideal distribution of wealth is. Each color represents 20% of the population, from poorest to wealthiest. The top 20% has 30% of the wealth, the bottom 20% are not doing so badly, and a strong middle class controls the majority of wealth. What this graph shows looks quite fair. This graph now shows what Canadians believe wealth distribution actually is. From this, it is obvious that we understand that the reality is far more unequal than what we think is ideal. Now here's what is most troubling. The two graphs above are far from the actual distribution in Canada. In fact, this is the reality that we live in. You can see that the bottom 40% of our population doesn't even make it onto the graph. What this here tells us is that across the board, Canadians think wealth in the country should be divided more equitably. We can also look at the same data by dividing the population into deciles. The wealthiest 10% of our nation controls nearly half of Canada's wealth, while the bottom 50% of the population together own less than 6% of the wealth. I don't know about you, but for me, this was hard to believe. When we organize the data geographically, we can see that BC is in fact the most unequal province, with the top 10% having 56% of the wealth and the bottom half owning just 3%. So what I've done here is organize the class according to the Canadian wealth proportions I've just shown you. Feel free to take a look at which decile you have been assigned to and what percentage of the class wealth you own. To further illustrate this point, let's assume that 500 poker chips represent all wealth in Canada, which in 2012 was around $8 trillion. Of the 500 chips, Zen will have 240 of them. His household wealth is $2.1 million. Philip will have 100 chips. Eli represents the middle 10% of Canadians, and he has only 17 chips. Hunter is the second poorest decile, and he has only half a chip. Will is the poorest in our class. Unfortunately, he has more debts than assets, so he is sitting at one negative chip, or negative $5,100. The problem doesn't stop here. The issue of wealth disparity is persistent and has become more severe with time. From 2005 to 2012, Zen's wealth increased 42%, while Will's wealth dropped 150%. Now that we have looked at Canada's wealth distribution from a statistical perspective, the question becomes, how does this translate to our justice system? Does Canada's wealth disparity pose a threat to the idea of a fair trial in our criminal justice system? The short answer is yes, it does. What is access to justice? Simply, it is being represented fairly in a trial. We have all heard of catchphrases such as presumption of innocence, or the burden of proof rests on the prosecution. However, the way our legal system is designed, those who are innocent but poor are still greatly marginalized. In Canada, legal fees average $338 per hour. Simply put, Our system works great for the wealthy, but for the poor and working class, it is a tremendous burden to go through either the civil or criminal justice system. Zen, who is our wealthiest 10%, is accused of a crime. He is able to find the best defense lawyer in the city. Now, it is difficult to predict exactly how much his legal services will cost since it depends on the nature of the case, but for a 10-day long trial, we can estimate the cost to be around $50,000. Publicly funded legal aid is very limited, and qualifications depend on factors such as income, health status, safety, location, and whether the case is civil or criminal. For our purposes, let's say Will qualifies for government legal aid. The process is difficult, but at the very least, he is fairly represented in court. So far, you might think that the justice system has worked perfectly because the poorest 10% had access to justice. However, what might surprise you is that they are not the most disadvantaged portion in the justice system. In fact, the working class, who are too poor to afford private services but not poor enough to qualify for legal aid, suffers the most. Due to the cartel-like power of the legal industry, a gap in justice is effectively created between costly services and free legal aid. In our example, Hunter and Eli are in the worst position since they are above the poverty line, but at the same time don't have the money for those astronomical legal fees. Research shows that almost 45% of Canadians have experienced a legal problem over the past 3 years, but fewer than 10% of those people sought legal assistance. This means that the majority simply gave up, while a portion of litigants chose to represent themselves in order to avoid costs. Self-representation is problematic because litigants are likely unable to present the facts of the case in a suitable manner, therefore needing assistance from the judge, which can be seen as bias in the trial. Furthermore, the lawyers on the other side may find the difficulty of their task greatly increased, driving up the cost to their clients even more. This so-called justice gap is a fundamental issue facing equal access to justice. The wealthiest are able to pay for the quality services, while the poorest can rely on court-appointed lawyers or access to free legal advice. A large portion of Canadians unfortunately fall into this justice gap. Now, make no mistake, Canada has a strong and healthy justice system that is the envy of many countries around the world. However, like every other human institutional endeavor, justice is an ongoing process. It is never done, never fully achieved. So now let us look at some potential solutions that address the greatest issue that we currently face: access to justice. In 2013, the Canadian Bar Association published a report titled Reaching Equal Justice. In it, a proposal was made that outlined concrete steps to improve access to justice across the system by 2030. I will share with you some of these solutions. Pro bono simply means for the public good, and it refers to free legal services to people who cannot otherwise afford them. By promoting and rewarding more pro bono work, the public-private divide in legal services can be bridged and allow for collaboration on a larger scale. While pro bono work can come from large law firms, it is mostly done by non-governmental organizations. Here are two examples of NGOs that deal with legal services. The Innocence Project exonerates wrongfully convicted people through DNA evidence. The John Howard Society works to reduce recidivism and prevent injustice in marginalized communities. Another solution that was proposed was to simplify the criminal justice system and to educate citizens on how to navigate it appropriately. Our current justice system, with its complicated jargons and procedures, is difficult for anyone without a formal law education to comprehend. Simplifying the system can reduce fees and assist unrepresented litigants. The report also recommended that law should be seen as a necessary life skill, and thus opportunities need to be provided for citizens to develop legal capabilities at various stages in their lives. This includes integrating law courses into the public education curriculum and offering legal training clinics to adults. Perhaps the most ambitious suggestion drawn by the CBA is a publicly funded universal legal coverage system, similar to what we have for healthcare. Despite government legal aid funding having dropped by 20% since the mid-90s, The report argues that access to justice should be a constitutional requirement and thus a shared governmental responsibility. This proposal may sound radical to some, but so was the debate about healthcare prior to the passing of the Medical Care Act in 1966. Now, universal healthcare has become a pillar in the Canadian identity. Just as the health system aims to both prevent and treat disease, so too the justice system should aim to prevent legal problems in addition to providing assistance when they arise. So in the end, you may ask me, which of these potential solutions is the best? Well, we may need a combination of all of these, or the real answer might even be none of them. To be honest, I really don't know. Even if I did, I would not be able to tell you in a 12-minute Pecha Kucha presentation. But I do hope that you guys can take away an understanding that equal access to justice is critical to social stability. It doesn't matter if we have the most fair laws or render the best court decisions. If portions of society do not have access, the entire system is useless. Some of you might think that we should just leave this huge issue to the people in Ottawa, the Supreme Court or the Parliament, and you might say it has nothing to do with us. But I believe that every single one of us here has everything to do with it. In fact, you are already part of the solution by taking this course and educating yourself on the basics of the Canadian legal system. What's more is that in 10 years, you guys will without a doubt be in a global network of doctors, businessmen, and lawyers. Regardless of what we go into, if we can all dedicate a portion of our careers in some way to ensuring equal access to justice, then we will have a good shot at improving one of the most pressing issues of our generation. Thank you.